September 25th, 1066. Stamford Bridge, East Riding of Yorkshire. When the first Norse scouts spotted the glinting armor across the River Derwent, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The English army, King Harald Godwinson's entire force, was bearing down on them with impossible speed. Harald Hardrada, the most feared warrior king in Christendom, stood in the autumn sun wearing nothing but leather and linen. No chainmail, no helmet, and no horses. His entire cavalry, 300 of the finest warhorses in Norway, sat uselessly aboard longships 9 miles away at Recall. The decision had seemed logical that morning. The weather was warm, the march would be short. They were collecting hostages from a defeated city, not expecting battle. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple tactical miscalculation. What happened in the next 6 hours would reveal how a single choice, leaving mounted warriors to fight on foot, would end the Viking Age in a single afternoon of slaughter. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment an entire civilization's way of war died in the English mud. Before we uncover the truth about Harald Hardrada's fatal mistake at Stamford Bridge, how the last great Viking king left his cavalry on ships and condemned 7,000 Norse warriors to death, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now, let's descend into one of history's most catastrophic military decisions. The autumn of 1066 didn't begin with omens, though later chroniclers would claim otherwise. It began with 3 men who believed they had rightful claim to England's throne, and only one crown to share between them. In Normandy, Duke William gathered ships and sharpened swords, convinced that Edward the Confessor had promised him the English throne. In Norway, Harald Sigurdsson, called Hardrada, Hard Ruler, prepared the largest invasion fleet Scandinavia had ever seen. And in England itself, Harald Godwinson had seized the crown within hours of Edward's death, breaking what many considered sacred oaths. But to understand why Harald Hardrada would make the decision that killed him, we need to understand who he was. This wasn't some reckless young prince hungry for glory. Harald Hardrada was 51 years old in 1066, a veteran of over 50 battles across 3 continents. He'd fought as a mercenary captain in the Byzantine Empire's Varangian Guard, crushing rebellions in Bulgaria and Sicily. He'd commanded fleets in the Mediterranean, amassed a fortune in Constantinople, and ruled Norway with an iron fist for 20 years. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, a giant by medieval standards. The sagas describe him as well-proportioned, with fair hair and a fair beard, one eyebrow slightly higher than the other. But it was his reputation that truly towered. They called him the Thunderbolt of the North. In 2 decades of Viking raids, he'd never lost a battle. When Harald looked at England in 1066, he saw more than conquest. He saw destiny. His claim to the English throne was tenuous, based on a supposed agreement between his nephew Magnus and the previous Danish king of England, Harthacnut. But Harald didn't need legal justification. He had 300 longships, somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 warriors, and an unbroken record of victory. The fleet that departed from Norway in early September 1066 was the last great Viking invasion force that would ever sail. Chronicles describe a forest of masts so dense you could walk across the fjord on ship decks. Each longship carried 30 to 40 warriors, their weapons, provisions for months, and, critically, horses. The decision to bring cavalry wasn't ceremonial. Norse warfare had evolved significantly from the old hit-and-run raiding days. By the 11th century, Scandinavian armies fought as combined arms forces, mounted warriors for pursuit and shock, armored infantry for sustained combat, archers for harassment. Harald's cavalry weren't just transportation. They were mobile heavy troops who could ride down fleeing enemies or flank a shield wall at the critical moment. The invasion began perfectly. Harald's fleet sailed down the English coast, raided the Orkneys and the Scottish shore, then swept into the Humber estuary like a storm. On September 20th, they engaged the northern English Earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford, just south of York. Fulford was a textbook Viking victory. Harold's forces crushed the northern English army in brutal close combat. The marshland ran red with English blood. York, the great northern capital, surrendered immediately. The city agreed to provide hostages and supplies and pledged to march south with Harald when he moved to claim the throne. Everything was proceeding exactly as the Norwegian king had planned. On the morning of September 25th, Harald received word that the English hostages would be delivered at Stamford Bridge, a small settlement about 7 miles east of York, where an old Roman road crossed the River Derwent. It was a routine handover, defeated cities providing noble-born guarantees of good behavior. There was no reason to expect resistance. The weather that September morning was unusually warm. The chronicler Henry of Huntingdon later wrote that the day was hot beyond measure. For warriors accustomed to Scandinavian cold, the English summer heat was oppressive. And here, in this moment of confidence and comfort, Harald Hardrada made his fatal choice. He would leave the horses behind. The decision rippled through the Norse army with barely a murmur of concern. Why would they need cavalry to collect hostages? The march was short, 7 miles through friendly countryside. They'd just destroyed the only English army in the north. King Harold Godwinson was 200 miles south in London, preparing for William of Normandy's expected invasion. There was no conceivable threat. Harold split his forces. Approximately 2/3 of his army, perhaps 5,000 warriors, would march to Stamford Bridge. The remaining third would stay at the ships and recall with all the horses, guarding the fleet and maintaining the supply line. But the first troubling detail emerges in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles account. Harold also left most of his armor behind. The weather being hot, they left their burnies at the ships, the Chronicle records. Burnies, chainmail hauberks that covered a warrior from neck to knee. Each one weighed 30 to 40 pounds of carefully riveted iron rings. In the September heat, wearing full armor for a 7-mile march to a peaceful hostage exchange seemed unnecessary. This wasn't cowardice. This was confidence bordering on complacency. The Norse warriors who marched toward Stamford Bridge that morning wore leather jerkins, padded gambesons, and carried their shields and weapons. But they left behind the armored protection that had kept them alive through decades of warfare. Tostig Godwinson marched beside Harold. He was Harold Godwinson's own brother, exiled from his Northumbrian earldom and burning for revenge. Tostig had invited Harold to invade, had promised him English support, had guided the Norse fleet to Yorkshire. Now he walked in the warm sunshine, finally on the verge of reclaiming his lost power. According to the sagas, Tostig and Harald discussed strategy as they marched. They spoke of the coming campaign south, of how the northern English would join them, of the weak resistance they expected from Harold's southern levies. They were planning a coronation, not preparing for battle. The second troubling detail, scouts reported no unusual activity. The road to Stamford Bridge showed normal traffic, peasants, merchants, travelers. York lay quiet behind them. The countryside appeared peaceful. This is what made what happened next so catastrophic. Around mid-morning, the Norse vanguard reached Stamford Bridge and began deploying along the western bank of the River Derwent. They spread out casually, many warriors removing their helmets in the heat, some reportedly bathing in the river. Weapons were stacked. The legendary Norse discipline, the shield wall formations that had won 100 battles, dissolved into informal clusters of resting warriors. Then a scout came running from the western road. At first he reported dust, then banners. Then, as his voice rose to panic, an army. An enormous English army moving at incredible speed already less than a mile away. It was impossible. King Harold and his housecarls, his elite professional warriors, were in London. The northern English forces lay shattered after Fulford. There was no army within 100 miles that could threaten them, but the impossible was happening. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. What Harald Hardrada's scouts saw approaching was one of the most impressive forced marches in medieval military history. King Harold Godwinson had received word of the invasion in London on September 19th. In 5 days, he'd gathered his army and covered nearly 200 miles, an average of almost 40 miles per day with a force of several thousand men. The speed was superhuman. Medieval armies typically marched 10 to 15 miles per day. Harold drove his forces through day and night, using pre-positioned supply caches along the Roman roads, probably rotating mounted scouts ahead to clear the path. His housecarls, professional warriors who trained year-round, formed the core, but he'd also gathered ferdmen, local militia levies, as he moved north. More importantly, Harold had kept his approach completely secret. York hadn't sent warning. Local populations hadn't revealed the English army's movements. Either Harold had enforced brutal operational security, or the northern English weren't as supportive of the Norse invasion as Harold had believed. The moment the Norse scouts brought their report, Harald Hardrada understood his mistake. Every instinct from 50 battles screamed the same calculation: they were fatally exposed. No cavalry for reconnaissance or flank security. No armor against English arrows and axes. No time to form proper defensive positions. The River Derwent at their backs, limiting retreat options. And yet, even now, Harold's legendary confidence held. The sagas record his response. He reportedly laughed, called for his banner Landwaster to be raised, and began shouting orders to form the shield wall. Because Harald Hardrada had one advantage left, his warriors were Vikings. The Norse force began the rapid, practiced deployment they'd drilled countless times. The shield wall, skjaldborg in Old Norse, was the fundamental Viking battle formation. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a mobile fortress of wood and iron. Spears protruded between the shields. The formation could advance, retreat, or hold ground against overwhelming odds if properly maintained. But building an effective shield wall required three things the Norse didn't have: time, armor, and space to maneuver. The initial formation that Harald managed to establish was desperate and improvised. Warriors were still running from the river, grabbing weapons, trying to find their position in the line. The shield wall that took shape along Stamford Bridge was thinner than standard, with warriors wearing inadequate protection, and without the cavalry that would normally protect their flanks. Then came the incident that would become legend. One massive Norse warrior, unnamed in the chronicles but immortalized in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles Echo, Dunt, took position at the bridge itself. The bridge was narrow, perhaps wide enough for 2 horses abreast. This single berserker held the crossing point. For over an hour he stood alone against the entire English vanguard. The chronicle describes him killing over 40 English warriors. Axes, swords, and spears couldn't reach him. The bridge's narrowness limited how many could attack simultaneously. He used his long axe with devastating effect, the reach allowing him to strike before English weapons could close. This one-man stand gave Harald precious time to organize his forces on the eastern bank, but it also revealed just how desperate their situation had become. They were depending on individual heroics because their tactical position was untenable. According to legend, the berserker was finally killed when an English soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the wooden planks. Whether true or embellished, the symbolic image is perfect: English cunning and patience defeating Norse fury. When the berserker fell, Harald's army poured across. What happened next is documented in multiple chronicles, both English and Norse, and the accounts align with horrifying consistency. The battle became a slaughter. Harald Hardrada's shield wall held longer than should have been possible. These were veteran warriors, many with decades of combat experience. But they were fighting without adequate protection against an army that had every advantage. English arrows fell in storms. Without mail, the Norse warriors died in terrible numbers. The sagas describe Harald himself taking an arrow in the throat early in the battle. The 7-foot king, the Thunderbolt of the North, the man who'd never lost a battle, died standing in his shield wall, blood pouring from his neck. With their king dead, the Norse lines wavered. Tostig Godwinson, fighting against his own brother, took command and refused Harald's offer of quarter. The battle continued. Harald Godwinson, watching his brother lead Norwegian invaders against England, made his own terrible choice. He ordered a general assault. The English forces, fresh and fully equipped, crashed into the under-equipped Norse warriors like a hammer on an anvil. The shield wall broke. What had been a battle became a rout. This is when the absence of cavalry became absolutely catastrophic. In medieval warfare, the pursuit phase after breaking an enemy formation was when most casualties occurred. A defeated army that could retreat in order, covered by cavalry, might lose 20 to 30% of its force. An army broken without mounted support to screen withdrawal could be annihilated. The Norse warriors ran. Back across the bridge, east along the road toward Rickall in their ships. English cavalry, Harald had brought his horses, rode them down like animals. The 7-mile road from Stamford Bridge to Rickall became a charnel house. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that there was great slaughter both of Norwegians and of English, but the English casualties were almost entirely from the initial battle. The slaughter along the road was one-sided butchery. Some Norse warriors tried to make stands at defensible points. All were overrun. Some stripped off their remaining gear to run faster. They died exhausted. The survivors who finally reached Rickall found their horses in the reserve forces, but by then it was too late. The Norwegian fleet had brought 9,000 warriors to England. After Stamford Bridge, fewer than 2,000 remained alive. The victorious English allowed the survivors to fill only 24 ships for their return to Norway. 300 longships had arrived. 24 departed. Harald Hardrada's body was recovered from the battlefield. Harald Godwinson had it treated with respect. This was still the brother of kings, a legendary warrior. The corpse was eventually returned to Norway, where Harald was buried in Trondheim. But one detail from the Norse accounts chills the blood. When they prepared Harald's body for transport, They discovered his back and legs covered in cuts and bruises. The 7-foot king had fallen forward when the arrow struck his throat, and his own warriors had trampled him in the chaos of the breaking shield wall. The Thunderbolt of the North died pinned under the feet of his own men, running from an enemy he'd assumed he would never face. King Harold Godwinson spent 5 days in York after the victory at Stamford Bridge, 5 days celebrating treating wounded, and allowing his exhausted army to rest after the forced march north and the brutal battle. He had destroyed the last great Viking invasion of England. The Norse threat that had haunted English shores for 250 years had been broken in a single afternoon. By any measure, Harold had achieved one of the most impressive military victories in medieval history. Then, on October 1st, messengers arrived from the south. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey on September 28th, 3 days after Stamford Bridge. While Harold celebrated in York, Norman forces were fortifying positions along the Sussex coast and raiding the English countryside. Harold faced the same calculation Harald Hardrada had made. Could he force march his army 200 miles in time to engage an enemy before they became unbeatable? The difference was that Harold's forces were already exhausted. Many of his best warriors had died at Stamford Bridge. The northern levies needed to return to their homes. His army was depleted, tired, and now had to repeat the superhuman march they just completed, but in reverse and toward an enemy who would be ready for them. Harold made the same choice he'd made before. He marched. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, is one of history's most famous engagements. What's less discussed is how Stamford Bridge shaped the outcome. Harold's forces at Hastings were significantly smaller than they should have been. His elite housecarls, the professional warriors who formed the core of his shield wall, had suffered casualties in Yorkshire that couldn't be replaced. Many of his best commanders were dead or wounded. The army that faced William was tired, understrength, and forced into defensive positions. Multiple historians have argued that if Harold had brought his full strength to Hastings, or if he'd waited for reinforcements instead of rushing to battle, the outcome might have been different. William's invasion was actually a desperate gamble. His forces were isolated on the coast, supply lines tenuous, and the longer he waited, the more dangerous his position became. But Harold had learned the wrong lesson from Stamford Bridge. He'd won through aggressive speed once. He tried the same strategy twice. At Hastings, the English shield wall held for most of the day. Norman cavalry charges broke against it repeatedly. But sometime in the late afternoon, accounts vary on details, the English line broke. Some say Harold died from an arrow to the eye. Others claim Norman knights cut him down in close combat. What's certain is that once the shield wall broke, the English army suffered the same fate as the Norse at Stamford Bridge, catastrophic losses during the pursuit. Without adequate cavalry to cover withdrawal, the English forces were run down and slaughtered. On Christmas Day, 1066, William of Normandy was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was destroyed, replaced with Norman lords. The English language absorbed French vocabulary. Land ownership, legal systems, architecture, and culture were transformed. All because two kings made the same mistake 3 weeks apart. Harold left his cavalry on the ships, and Harold exhausted his army destroying Harold. But the deeper investigation reveals something more troubling than tactical errors. The Battle of Stamford Bridge wasn't just a military defeat. It was the end of the Viking Age. For 2.5 centuries, Norse warriors had terrorized European coasts. From Lindisfarne in 793 to Stamford Bridge in 1066, the dragon ships and their crews had been the most feared military force in Christendom. They'd conquered kingdoms, extracted tribute from emperors, and settled from Iceland to Sicily. Stamford Bridge revealed that the age of Viking dominance was over, and the reason why illuminates something profound about military evolution and human nature. Harald Hardrada was the last of the old-style Viking kings. His military success had been built on the tactics and strategies that had worked for his grandfather's generation: superior ships for strategic mobility, fierce warriors for close combat, and the psychological terror of the Norse reputation. But warfare had evolved. By 1066, European armies had learned to counter Viking tactics. They built fortifications that couldn't be easily raided. They developed heavy cavalry that could break shield walls. They created professional military systems that could match Norse warrior quality. Most critically, they'd adopted combined arms warfare, integrated infantry, cavalry, and archers operating in coordinated tactics. The Norse, paradoxically, had been slower to adapt despite their own military sophistication. Harold's decision to leave his cavalry behind reflected an older mindset, that infantry shield walls were the decisive arm, that battles were won by warrior quality rather than tactical flexibility, that reputation and fierceness mattered more than combined arms coordination. The cruel irony is that Harald knew better. His Byzantine service had exposed him to the most advanced military systems in the world. He'd fought alongside cavalry, commanded integrated forces, seen how tactical sophistication defeated mere courage. But at Stamford Bridge, in the warm English sunshine, collecting hostages from a defeated city, Harald reverted to the old Viking confidence. The horses could stay behind. This wasn't a real battle. That reversion killed him and ended an age. The impact on Scandinavian culture was immediate and profound. The saga literature from the following generations is saturated with nostalgia and loss. Stamford Bridge became the symbolic end of Norse military glory. Later sagas would describe it as the last time the old gods favored their warriors. More practically, Scandinavian military organization transformed. Norwegian and Danish kings of the later 11th and 12th centuries built professional armies modeled on European feudal lines. They adopted heavy cavalry, constructed castles, and integrated their forces into the broader European military system. The last independent Viking raid occurred in 1098, 32 years after Stamford Bridge. After that, Scandinavian military actions were conducted by organized kingdoms using European tactics, not independent Viking warbands. But the battle also reveals something darker about human psychology and decision-making under success. Harald Hardrada had won 50 battles before Stamford Bridge. That perfect record became a cognitive trap. Each victory reinforced his belief in his own judgment, his tactical instincts, his ability to assess military situations. The pattern was clear: trust your experience, and you'll win. This is what psychologists now call the success trap, when past victories create overconfidence that blinds you to changed circumstances. Harald saw Stamford Bridge through the lens of 50 previous battles, not as the unique tactical situation it actually was. Modern military analysis has studied Stamford Bridge extensively because it demonstrates how organizational culture and personal experience can override tactical reality. The U.S. Army War College uses Harald's decision as a case study in the dangers of assuming past success predicts future outcomes. Even more chilling, Harald probably realized his mistake within minutes of seeing the English army approach. But by then, the decision was irreversible. The horses were 9 miles away. The army was committed. The only choice was to fight or surrender, and surrender was unthinkable for the Thunderbolt of the North. He'd trapped himself through confidence. For England, Stamford Bridge's legacy is complicated. Harold Godwinson's brilliant victory is overshadowed by his defeat at Hastings. The what-ifs haunt historians. What if Harold hadn't invaded, allowing Harold to face William with fresh troops? What if Harold had waited at Stamford Bridge instead of rushing south? What if he'd brought his cavalry differently, learned different lessons, made different choices? The Norman conquest transformed England so completely that Stamford Bridge became a footnote, the battle before the battle that mattered. But it's worth remembering that for 2 weeks in September and October 1066, Harold Godwinson was the most successful military commander in Europe. He'd destroyed the greatest Viking invasion ever assembled through brilliant forced marching and tactical aggression. Then those same qualities destroyed him. The fields around Stamford Bridge are quiet now. The river Derwent flows peacefully. There's a monument marking where the battle occurred, but most travelers pass without noticing. But if you visit on a September afternoon, when the weather turns unseasonably warm, locals say you can still feel something wrong in the air. A tension, a waiting. Maybe it's just the weight of knowing that 7,000 men died here because one king made one choice on one hot morning. Or maybe it's something deeper. The ghost of the moment when an entire age of history died in the English mud. What do you think drove Harald Hardrada to leave his cavalry behind? Was it simple overconfidence, or something more complex? A cultural blindness to how warfare had evolved? Could any commander have made a different choice with his experience and assumptions? Leave your theories in the comments below. This is the kind of historical mystery that reveals as much about human nature as military tactics. If you found this story as chilling as we did, subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of history where a single decision changed everything. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And remember, the scariest moments in history aren't always the supernatural ones. Sometimes the real horror is how quickly confidence becomes catastrophe, how the lessons that made us successful can become the blindness that destroys us. See you in the next video.